This presentation considers how the creators of BBC's Sherlock, Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, used transitions and associated post-production forms to portray thought and smoothly transition through each scene. Sherlock, a contemporary retelling of the classic stories by Sir Arthur Doyle, first aired on the 25th of July 2010 and stars Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman. This version of Sherlock is often praised for the phenomenal filmmaking, the actor choice, storytelling and writing. The original Sherlock stories consist of 56 short stories and 4 books written by Doyle. Since Sherlock was originally created, he has barely been out of public eye, having many adaptations and TV shows. One of the main characteristics of Sherlock is his intelligence and use of deduction when solving cases. In the BBC version of Sherlock, the way his thought process is portrayed is through on-screen graphics, transitions, and a montage of clips. These are all a part of the post-production process. The main way which points and thought processes are shown is through editing, specifically the graphics and transitions. The key thing about editing is really about selection, choice, decision-making, problem-solving, creativity, understanding, sensitivity, and narrative purpose at 1/24th of a second. A transition is a technique used in post-production by which scenes and shots are combined. The most common method of transition is just a simple cut to the next shot. The Kuleshov Effect is a film editing montage effect, which was demonstrated by Lev Kuleshov in 1910s and 20s. This method looks at the idea that a montage of 3 shots in a sequence can create a meaning. For example, a shot of someone with a neutral face, then a shot of food, then a shot back to the face, but this time they're smiling, could give the impression that a person is hungry. By changing the middle shot, this can give many impressions. For example, if you put an image of a family cartoon, this could change the whole sequence to indicate joy. When this theory was thought of, it was a phenomenon. Viewers could look for more meaning from interactions of 2 shots together, rather than a single shot in isolation. This idea is still being used today, with montages often used in TV and film. For example, at the beginning of Sherlock, Series 1, Episode 1, the show begins with Dr. Watson's nightmare sequence. This shows a montage of clips where he's remembering his traumatic past in the army. Then, shots of him asleep, clearly distressed at the images he's remembering. Once the nightmare sequence is over, Watson sits up looking distressed about what he just remembered. This allows the audience to learn a lot about him as a character. We can learn he's ex-army and is clearly struggling with post-traumatic stress, as otherwise he wouldn't have been distressed about the shots in his dream. The transition between these shots are subtle and almost invisible, but you can clearly see the transitions between the dream and reality, making it clear to the audience. One thing which is really prominent in Sherlock is invisible transitions. This is where a transition is hidden within a scene. For example, in many scenes, characters will walk past the camera to cover it with themselves or a coat. Obviously, this will cause blackness, and within the darkness there's a cut. Another example is a common transition which is used in the show, a half-door transition. A door, usually from the right of the screen, opens and characters walk through it, which then creates a new scene. On the opposite side of the screen, the previous scene will slowly fade down while the new scene fades up in its place. This transition is invisible as the audience will have their focus pulled to the right of the screen, allowing the transition to appear smooth and invisible. One transition which I found particularly brilliant is the 2nd episode of the 4th season. Sherlock is coming down from a heroin high after meeting with Faith Smith and is walking around the streets eating chips for the night. This transition occurs when Sherlock begins to have withdrawal symptoms from the heroin. It begins with a loud horn pulling Sherlock out of his thoughts, and he realises where he is. This is shown with an aerial shot from above, then cut to a focused shot on the driver who is yelling at him. There's a reverse shot to Sherlock. Next we see Sherlock's friend, whom he lives with in Baker Street, stood in the road. Then another reverse shot to Sherlock, followed by a shot of his friend, who is now in Baker Street. Then Sherlock in the street again. Once his friend says that they're both in Baker Street, Sherlock goes through a moment of realization, creating a moment of clarity. We know this happens as the new background of the scene drops into the frame, similarly to a stage transition. This fits the moment of realization perfectly and shows just how Sherlock's mind is processing everything, and his mind is finally catching up with him. Summing up, the transitions in Sherlock are often used to show smooth edits between shots. Often what is used are invisible transitions into scenes. The show cleverly uses their transitions to push the boundaries of television shows and filmmaking. These are very often used to keep up with the pacing of the show. Many transitions throughout the show show Sherlock's thought process and how he's thinking, and they very cleverly portray just enough thoughts to keep the audience hooked.